My name is Nicholas Falk, and I'm delighted to be here 5 years on from our last conference in Tirunelveli. We are trying to move ideas forward and turn them into action, because in my view, we know enough about the problems, and we even know quite a lot about solutions. The challenge is turning the vision into reality. What is so exciting about what we heard already is how this very area has been transformed. Dr. Cletus said it took 6 years. Well, I think it's actually going to take a generation to achieve the kinds of transformation that the world needs. But because of the growth of India and the demand that there is on land and housing, the scope for creating the same sort of transformation in terms of quality that we've seen here is possible. I'm an economist. I've written reports and books. I've been involved in advising lots of governments. And I want to tell you a little bit about the journey that I've made to come to the notion that the place to focus on is India now. I started my transformation in California. I went to a place called Stanford University, to the business school, because I believed that America offered the solutions to problems of economic growth. I thought there were techniques I could learn at Stanford. Well, I actually found out that what mattered was a phrase that the man who created Nike used, which is just do it. It was an attitude towards action, which explains how the sorts of names that you see every day on technology, on software and so on, can be found all over around San Francisco and Palo Alto. And I then started my own company in 1976, a not-for-profit research and consultancy group. And it seemed to me that we had to deal with problems of industrial decline and wasteland that it had left behind. And this, however, created opportunities for creating new settlements that were forward-looking. And we found, you can't see this unfortunately, but it's a site in a forest outside 6 miles from the industrial city of Swansea. We came up with a plan. I managed to raise finance for it from a French bank, and we started building. We built a great bridge over the railway, a road, and some 20 houses. But by the time the houses were ready for occupation, the economy had collapsed. Nobody bought a house. I'm afraid we were, in a sense, kicked off, and nothing happened. Well, I went back to this location only a year ago to find the whole village that we had planned had been built. Almost 500 houses had been created. The first houses were the ones on the bottom left. And what was really exciting to me was to find that some things that happened we hadn't planned. There was a shop. I found that inconceivable. The shop had been set up by a man from Delhi. And I asked him, what's it like here? He said, it's the happiest place I've ever been in. I thought that was a test of success. So though we didn't achieve quite what we wanted, it shows that if you start something in the right place, you can eventually achieve change. In terms of talking about India now, we started this process almost 10 years ago, and as I explained, we've had a series of symposia in different places. All these reports are available. If you look on the Urbed Trust website, you'll see a whole lot called Indian Urban Futures, and you can get into the reports. And also there are some videos of conferences. And as has already been mentioned by Charles, we built a little house to test out some ideas to show that it was possible to build without it was possible to build using natural resources, including, of course, the sun. I think you probably all know that half the world is urbanized now. It took place, I think, at the millennium, 2000. But at that time, at least, most people in India lived in rural areas. And so the question in my mind was, would the mega cities like Delhi or Chennai or Mumbai continue to dominate? Because it seemed to me from experience in London that if you just rely on your capital, you end up with disparities, inequalities, which are impossible to bridge. And so there are 5 global challenges which I think cities offer an answer to. The first one is escalating economic change. They are the places where innovation typically takes place and where innovations are turned into practice. Partly that's because cities attract young people, they have universities, and they go on to work in small and growing businesses. But there's also rising youth unemployment, because apart from the sort of those who've qualified, as you will have here, there are people who've got no qualifications and who feel rather desperate about their future. There are competing demands for space and water because of a growing population, and a polarization between the rich and the poor, which is probably as great a problem as climate change in the sense that it can lead to civil war. And finally, I can remind you, we only have this one planet. Despite Musk's hope to somehow take people off to Mars or whatever, I think the reality for most people is living in the place that we started in. And those disparities, which this chart shows, you won't be able to understand it, but I can tell you that the middle class, if you like, are growing in numbers, but so are the extreme poor. And when I came for my first time in India to a conference in Goa, I was on my way in a train to Mumbai, and I got out of the train in order to actually look at the locomotive, and I took this picture of a boy wondering, I think, whether he should jump on the train and go on to Mumbai or stay wherever it was. And that reminded me of the choice that people and countries have to make of whether the investment should be in mega cities like Chennai or in rural villages. Can we keep people in the country? Or is there another future in terms of mid-sized towns? And here I'm thinking of tier 2 and tier 3 cities of around 500,000 to under 1 million. And when I looked at the kind of stories in the Hindu at the time, there was the notion that India was changing, but there were also tensions. And I could see there were too many questions. Is it important to answer the problem of transport, or housing, or energy, or water, or food, or others? And in some ways, if one can create new settlements or create extensions to existing settlements that are better, then one can begin to meet those problems in a practical way. So what is one actually to do in reality? Well, the start is, of course, making the most of what you've got, your existing and underused assets. And I was struck as I went around India for the first time about the heritage being neglected. And it seemed to me tragic, because I'd seen how in England we had left our heritage and forgotten about it, and buildings crumbling, which could be turned to new uses. So I do think a first priority is always to reuse what you've got and to recycle buildings as well as everything else. A second is to drive less. And again, it was very obvious to a visitor that there were just too many vehicles on the road, and however many flyovers or bypasses you built, you could never solve that problem. There just isn't the space. It doesn't matter whether you have electric cars or electric bikes. You've got to somehow reduce the pressure, and I call it tame the car. And this means walking and cycling more. In some cases, as in Ahmedabad, it may be possible to have a rapid transit system. But I notice that on the whole, the space between either side of the road is quite narrow, so you haven't got the space to put in preference for buses. But you do have the possibility of creating bike lanes, not freeways. These may be electric bikes. And you could take inspiration from Copenhagen in Denmark. Now, you may say the climate is totally different in Copenhagen, or the situation is different, but I can tell you 40 years Copenhagen was in an economic mess, and now it's the happiest place in Europe, and in part this is because it's built the right kind of settlements. You've got to, of course, save energy, and again I notice how the earth was being dried out, and the climate change, the temperature rises seem inevitable. But you can harvest the sun. Now, when I first came here, I didn't see solar panels. I didn't see even the sorts of tanks on the roof used to heat water that you see in, say, Israel. But I felt that the example of Freiburg in Germany is very relevant. It became known as Europe's solar capital, and they have energy plants close to where the houses are, using recycling or producing renewable energy. And interestingly, that initiative started because the state was proposing to build a nuclear power station there, and local people said, we don't want nuclear, and the state said, well, you better find an alternative, and the alternative was to use the sun. Here, of course, you're showing the way in using biogas, turning waste into energy, and it's a model, I think, that could be replicated in many other cities, and we can learn from. The next priority, it seems to me, is to improve health. And this is not just about building hospitals, though they are necessary, of course, but it's to produce better lives by people eating better food. That means producing better food and encouraging people to eat better food. So I think that's a very important part of change, and it also is about bringing water into the villages. And I started a little project, your Prime Minister said toilets first, temples later, and I thought that was a rather good phrase. I think there is the chance to create real wealth out of some of the old buildings. I think I've seen them in this trip, and the use of those old buildings as incubators for small enterprises, and also creating markets which allow small people, if you like, to start their own business. And this is something I set up in South London. But now I'm going to get to the main theme, which is about growing garden settlements, because there's only so much you can do with the resources of the existing town. And you do have to begin to look at the edges. And I was appalled to see land that looked as though it was ideal for growing food being built on, and possibly by luxury executive houses, because of lack of planning. That is a picture of on the right of how Rieselfeld, a former sewage works on the edge of Freiburg, looks from the air. And on the left is a plan that we drew up for how to apply these sorts of principles actually to the growth of Oxford. And a new garden settlement it has a number of features. I'd just like to run through them. I think the first priority is it offers space for good and affordable homes. It's not enough just to produce, as we did in Swansea, space for, if you like, business executives, and in those 500 homes, but to get a mix of houses, and the houses should be forward-looking. One should be designing places that reduce car use. One won't eliminate cars altogether, but one can certainly do a whole lot of things to encourage alternatives. A new settlement could be meeting energy needs in an efficient way. It can have a local generation system. Any waste heat can be reused. And it can make people healthier. And it seems to me it's not just about growing food close to where you live, but it's the very sight of greenery. I have to say, when I come into Scad here, sorry, not here, in Chennai Devi, my heart rises. I feel I've reached paradise. And it seems to me that idea of settlements which for greenery is not just because trees look nice, but of course they keep places cool, reducing temperatures by, I think it's 3 degrees. If you can keep the sun out and also generate a bit of the water vapor that the trees produce, then it seems to me you're producing a livable environment. So these things are not just for architects, they're things that meet the needs of everyone. And the final thing is to rebalance town and country. We have to get away from the idea of two worlds, those who live in the town and those who live in the country, and to create places that bring the best of both together. And the scheme that won an award that I showed you briefly, 50% was given over to green space. And here is how a city might grow. This is with 3 new settlements on the edge. They would have at least 10,000. And it seems to me you get there in stages. You don't build 10,000 homes at once, but you build it in perhaps 20 units, and then you build 100, and then you build 1,000, and so on. Step by step, you create the place. I always say, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is a bite at a time. And studies have shown that successful projects are those that break growth down into stages or steps, what I call balanced incremental development. And here is the sort of plan we had for how to grow Oxford. And we started with trying to change minds by getting people round tables discussing what they felt was needed, something we may do this afternoon. Unfortunately, we failed to convince the local authorities to work together. And they all had their own priorities. Some just wanted to keep everyone out of the countryside. They wanted to keep Oxford as it was. And so there wasn't enough commitment. There wasn't a shared vision that could overcome those bureaucratic and institutional constraints. Well, because of the problems in places like Oxford, I might say that there was one place where we worked in which is a model for growth, and that's in Cambridge, where we took people around the world. We put them on bicycles. This is in Amersfoort, in Holland, and people learnt from seeing things that they liked, and then we turned those principles into the Cambridgeshire Quality Charter for Growth. And that charter has guided growth. So yes, you need master plans, yes, you need development frameworks, but you also need a set of principles that people are signed up to. And I think the important thing was, okay, I drafted it, but it was in fact the work of 100 people who came on these visits, and we simply drew the conclusions together under 4 C's: connectivity, character, community, and climate proofing, which was a new thing. So there's the kind of way a city might grow in stages around a spine of a rapid transit link. And the government has changed, and instead of a government that just said, leave everything to the market or let people make money, we've now got a government which at least talks about planning new communities. And they want to build 12 new towns, and there's a task force which has just come out with its interim report. These are the proposals, and this is how I'm going to finish, that we've argued should be taken up by the task force, but which I think are also relevant to India. The first thing is we should learn from how the Dutch plan housing. So there's one country which perhaps because it was in danger of flooding, it's underwater for the most part, they've accepted the idea of planning for hundreds of years. And they planned to respond to growth some 95, say 100 new settlements in a population of 16 million. So that gives you an idea of scale. They're typically between 2,000, 5,000, a fewer 10,000 homes. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of how they've built new housing around water. Secondly, financial reform is key. We're not going to build on the scale that's required without being able to mobilize the financial resources. And that means not just looking to government for tax revenue, because there's always too many pressures on government to be able to meet the needs of development, but it does mean harnessing the private sector. How does one do that? Well, I think the first thing is to be able to take control of land, to assemble land in areas with growth potential, and to make a charge on that land. In other words, there's a value created out of development and out of planning, part of which can go into improving infrastructure, which in turn can provide the returns that long-term investors are looking for, pension funds who have to pay out in 20, 30 years' time. Land value rating or land value capture is an important principle which is beginning to be talked about everywhere. I suspect it's being talked about in India. And there are plenty of good examples. On the right is another example from Copenhagen, building a new town. And the new town funded the building of their first metro. There was enough value out of the development of the land, the public land, to be able to pay for a metro, which links it. It's only about 5 miles, say, from the center of Copenhagen. You've got to have growth bonds, which means of raising finance against the security of the land. And finally, I think that means there's a role for state investment banks. And we now have a national wealth fund, which is supposed to be supporting innovation in energy, and I think could also be used to support new settlements. The local capacity, however, has to be rebuilt. It's no good doing these things at a regional level, say, if you haven't got national support. And it seems to me, therefore, there is a power, a capacity to create the agencies that are needed using what are called development corporations. That basically means bodies that act in the long-term public interest over, say, looking at least 20 years life, but can take over land and borrow money. There's also a role at the more local level for community land trusts, and there's a lot of interest in parts of Europe, and to some extent inspired by the USA, in people being able to club together, to work together to create places that they want to live in and then take on management. And that's very much what happens in Freiburg, where building cooperatives, if you like, small groups, could get together, the sites are made available by the local authority, and then a group of people, maybe 5 or 10 families, appoint an architect to build a house on a plot, within an overall plan or set of principles. And finally, a cadre of doers and urbanists. Now, I go back to the slogan of the man who built up Nike, you know, the shoe company, of just do it. So we have to start somewhere, and we believe that railway junctions are a very good place to focus. You have a railway junction in Tirunelveli. What an excellent place for, therefore, developing garden settlements. We show in Oxford how you could create a metro, starting by just running fast trains on, regular trains on local lines, and Brian Love will be talking about this. Land value capture in some areas, not every area, but in some parts, can be vital. So, let's go for greener growth now. Thank you.